This is Football at 4.
And Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. It is brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Andrew DiCecco is here. That fire, do they have it? Can they re-find it? Andrew has been along this team all season long. I'm wondering if he can put his finger on where it's been lost. Is there a time that you can pinpoint, Andrew, inside that locker room or something that happened that you could say, you know what, this team changed at this moment? Is there something, anything that sticks out to you?
Well, there was nothing, at least inside the locker room or internally, that really caught my attention. More so for me, it was the San Francisco 49ers game. Just at one point, being down 21-6, just getting thoroughly outclassed. I think it really drove home the point that the Eagles, showed the discrepancy between the two teams and how far away the Eagles actually were to being considered among the NFL's elite when you finally faced a team that was superior and they exploited a lot of your weaknesses. I think they left that game with a lot more questions than they had answers, and that's really where you started to see, okay, are we for real, and are we going to be able to get this fixed? Do we have the guys in place to make sure that we get this righted? And I think that if that were me, like me guessing right now, that's where I would pinpoint it.
Yeah, I mean, that game was interesting because you really, got dominated. Then the next week you lose to Dallas, and, that was a sloppy game. But is it surprising to you at how clunky this has all looked? I mean, it's one thing, hey, we just don't have enough talent, but they don't not only seem to not have enough talent, and we know this is a pretty talented team, they look disorganized and clunky, and this team just looks so out of sorts from the first, half of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. And you can argue that even in the early part of the season, they still lacked that cohesiveness, that ability to put teams away early. And I was one who commended them early in the season for being one of those teams that rose to the occasion when their backs were against the wall and found different ways to win. They didn't really face a whole lot of adversity at all last season, and I thought they did a decent job in the initial months of the season in responding to that. But then you started to see some of the blemishes really surface, especially when you faced teams that were able to exploit that, and they were equipped to exploit that. And then you started to wonder, oh, okay, is this really are they going to be able to get this corrected realistically? Sometimes you can't just get by with pure talent, especially defensively, when you don't have when you have a lot of aging players, you don't have a lot of bona fide playmakers. There's not a whole lot that you can do to alter your scheme and things like that. So that's where it started to become reality to me that this is sort of who the Eagles are.
Let's get into that a little bit. What are you seeing defensively? Because I know, you're in the building, so you get a chance to see them from up top, kind of that aerial view. What are you seeing defensively? I mean, if you're watching the game on TV, it might be a little bit harder to see. But to me, it seems as if Matt Patricia was basically handed the playbook of Sean Desai and then tried to implement some of his own principles, and you have some sort of morphing of two different defensive schemes that really aren't on the same page. What do you see from your seat in the press box?
Yeah, I think to a degree that's fair to say, and I don't know that you and I have even touched on this subject because I don't know if you were on air or we may have been passing when they made that actual switch, but I talked to Ryan about this a few weeks ago and I maintain that Sean Desai got a raw deal. I thought he was a scapegoat, and a lot of folks were saying it can't get any worse. Well, it got a lot worse. And you're seeing Matt Patricia try to put his own, sprinkle in his own, get his fingerprints on the defense, and not necessarily for the better. You're seeing players like Josh Sweat being asked to drop into coverage. You're seeing Hassan Reddick being asked to take some snaps at off-ball linebacker. You're seeing a heavy three safety look, but you're also seeing a heavy usage of personnel. So you're not necessarily getting a lot of continuity. Guys are shuffling in and out of the lineup. There's not a lot of cohesiveness or continuity on that back seven. And it seems like, and this is including veterans like Kevin Byard and James Bradbury and the linebacker, that they're just not on the same page. And at this point in the season, that's inexcusable. And you have to wonder, Do you? I mean, at this point, you're not really going to see a whole lot of changes, but they should have simplified things, because when you're seeing veterans like Avonte Maddox and James Bradbury and Zach Cunningham and Mora, who's a really smart guy, and they're not able to get this down, and they look lost out there. I can think back to that play on Sunday where it was Tyrod Taylor threw it down the left sideline. There was 3 Eagles defenders there. It was over top of Maddox. Reed was coming over, and Ricks was behind that and ended up making the tackle. There's 3 guys in the area, and no one knew who had the receiver. That, to me, is emblematic of what the Eagles' issues are defensively. And that was just the Giants. What do you think a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is going to be able to do to exploit your weaknesses over the middle? I just see Matt Patricia complicating an already a defense that was already reeling and had a lot of players questioning what their responsibilities were.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people are very perplexed at like Josh Sweat or Hassan Reddick drop into coverage. And look, that happens from time to time, and sometimes it happens through the course of the year, and we don't really notice it all that much. But what do you say when you're seeing them guys being used in that role? Is it a, hey, look, this happens, everybody drops their, or are you perplexed as much as a lot of people are?
Well, perplexed in the sense that these guys they're just now being asked to do this. If you're going to ask that, that's
so in other words, Andrew, Gannon and Desai did not ask those guys to drop, or at nearly as much.
Not nearly as much. And if this was part of what they were going to be required to do this season, well, that's something that you implement in OTAs and in training camp. You don't just throw it in there. At this stage of the season, when guys are ill-equipped to do that, they don't look comfortable doing that, and you're not putting your best players on defense in optimal position to be successful. So I think this case of Matt Patricia getting too cute and trying to put his spin on Sean Desai's defense and complicating a defense for players that, and that's what you're seeing. And you're seeing just guys that are not on the same page. Teams are taking advantage of it, and the even better teams are going to pounce on that pretty early. You saw it last week on that 18-yard completion on I guess it was the first play of the game, and Darius Slayton. Teams aren't hesitating to take advantage of the Eagles. The middle of the field's wide open, and it's sort of parting like the Red Sea. Yeah. And like I said, it's Matt Patricia right now, and he's taken a defense that already had leaks in it. Don't get me wrong. Sean Desai I'm not absolving him in any of this, but he took that defense and somehow found a way to make it worse.
Andrew DiCecco, Football 4 from InsideTheBirds.com. Give me your thoughts on the Sidney Brown injury and what kind of impact will that have? He's a rookie, so I don't know if people are looking at it as big of a deal, but do you think it's a big deal?
Yeah, a lot of folks may not agree with it, but my main takeaway, I thought that the most significant takeaway, I should say, coming out of that Giants loss was the loss of Sidney Brown. When you look at it in terms of a player who the Eagles were banking on to be a starter next season, well, now his timeline's murky, and that might not be till October that he comes back. So now you're probably going to need 2 starting safeties. He was a key depth player, and the Eagles were really reliant on 3 safety looks under Matt Patricia. Well, now that you have to sort of scrap that, I would think, and find a way to utilize different players, unless you're going to rely on someone like a Tristan McCollum or I don't know, a Mekhi Garner or whatever. But I also think that he was just a player that was growing and evolving into a role, and not to have that, your depth takes a tremendous hit, and you only have 2 safeties you can rely upon, and then you have 2 younger players that really haven't played a whole lot of football in the players that I just mentioned.
Andrew, we talked about this earlier before you came on, but we were kind of comparing the fact that people are looking at Brian Johnson getting a with Carolina and saying, hey, take him, drive him to the airport. And we talked about John Gannon getting an interview last year and then ultimately getting hired, and people were so ready to move on from Gannon. I'm not suggesting that this defense would be much better if Gannon was here. Maybe they would. My opinion would be that they would be better. That being said, that's not my point. My question more is, there are multiple guys that were here last year in a similar defense who are not having anywhere near the same year. What is your thought on why guys like Sweat and maybe Reddick and Graham, Bradbury, even Slay, if you want to throw him in there, are not having the even close to the years for some of those guys that they did last year?
It's a great question, and I have a few answers to this. When you're looking at it in terms of Josh Sweat and Brandon Graham, to me, that's it's in Brandon Graham's case, it's age, and I think that it's starting to surface. They're minimizing his snaps, and when he's out there, he hasn't been overly noticeable or effective. But when you're looking at from Josh Sweat's standpoint, there's not a whole lot of depth behind him. He's being asked to do a lot, and he's wearing down. It's as simple as that. He's wearing down. He's getting his pressures, but he's not finishing the deal when he is getting to the quarterback. I look at that Arizona Cardinals game on that touchdown pass to James Conner. That's a play that you have to finish because he had Kyler Murray in his crosshairs and wasn't able to wrap him up. But largely, I think you're seeing a defensive line that's been asked to log a ton of snaps, and they're wearing down. They just have tired legs. But you have to look at Howie for not supplementing the depth. And going into the season, Mike, that was something that I mentioned, the depth on the defensive line. It was really top-heavy, but there wasn't a lot of reinforcements to sort of replenish like a hockey line like they've had in the past. Now, in the secondary, that to me is a classic example of a unit that just got really old, really sluggish, and slow. And it shows up on tape when I've rewatched the game back. It looks that way when I watch it in real time. And they're missing tackles. But in James Bradbury's case, you talk about rush, cover, rush. The Eagles have struggled to marry coverage and pass rush this season. And when you're asked to cover longer and your pass rush isn't getting home, and you're a guy like James Bradbury who doesn't have that long speed, that makeup speed, and he's not overly fluid, you get exploited a little bit. The Eagles had 70 sacks last season, and sometimes Bradbury was a byproduct of the pass rush getting home. And now that they're not doing that, you're seeing teams be able to take advantage of it. And by the way, there were opportunities last season for Bradbury to get exploited, and some teams had success in doing that. Others, if you go back and watch the tape, you'll see receivers getting a big step on them. They just don't happen to look in that direction. And Blankenship's being asked to take on a larger role this season. And I don't know that he's equipped to do that. I think he's wearing down. He looks really small. I think he looks to me like he's lost weight throughout the season. Uncharacteristic missing tackles and things like that. So that to me is sort of the answer that I've been able to ascertain from watching this defense
Good
this year.
stuff with Andrew DiCecco breaking down some of the defensive issues that obviously this defense is completely. I think the offense has been clunky. It is what it is, but I mean they still even by accident sometimes they score 24 to 30 points. I mean, which is crazy to think about. But I think this defense has slipped so much that it has given people no hope. And you talk about 70 sacks last year. Do you think the 70 sacks that they got last year is more based on the talent or the scheme that they had? Now you're down to 43 this year.
Yeah, and 43 is still a good number, but 70 sacks was never going to happen. That was a historic number that was you'd be anybody would be hard pressed to replicate. But Javon Hargrave, losing him, that interior pass rush up the middle, would he have 11 sacks last year? That was a big loss. And the linebackers behind the defensive line, T.J. Edwards and Kaiser White, were better fits for that defense, for what Jonathan Gannon needed them to do in run fits and fill in the gaps. But I thought that there was just a lot more of a fresh set of legs, a healthy rotation. So I just like the personnel and what they had available to them. They were able to send waves of pass rush out there, and it seemed like guys were fresh throughout the season, whereas now you just don't see a lot of push. You don't see a lot of fight. And Mike, you and I have talked about this. These are against offensive lines that are among the league's worst that they're not able to take advantage of.
Well, I think that's a good point.
The Jets, the Seahawks.
That's a great point, Andrew, that we could have looked back on. Now, if you're looking at like where the breadcrumbs could have started with this defense, games against Washington, as you just said, the Jets, teams that just do not have good offensive lines. And I remember, we do the matchups on Thursday with you all year, and it's like, well, they have a big advantage up front against this offensive line. And at the end of those games, you're saying their defensive front did not win that battle, and that's why those games you lost to the Jets, and the two games against Washington were way closer than you thought because the defense didn't – you gave up 30 points both times you played Washington. Those were some hints that this defensive line was not the same.
100%. And I've been asked this a few different times throughout the season. What's been the most surprising element to the Eagles this season, in my opinion? And to me, it's the lack of pass rush. Going into the season, that's what this team could hang their hat on. That's what they invested heavily in, and that's what their philosophy really that's what it's built on. And they're not able to get home, and their offensive line, looking at the other side, they haven't been performing to standard. They've been fine, but they haven't been performing to standard. But looking at it from a defensive line standpoint, that's something that was a foundational piece to this team, and something that you could build around, and it was ultimately going to help the secondary. They're not able to get home, and you're seeing a trickle-down effect and it's sort of it's bleeding into the whole defense, and it's problematic. They're not able to stop anybody, Mike, and I don't think that there's one team out there that this team couldn't lose to.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting pushed around and bullied by – I go back to Arizona goal line, and he's just getting run over – you realize, like, this guy is just smaller, he's slower, and it's at those moments where you're like, it's almost sad to watch. I felt bad for Blankenship in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And Reed, to me, and I was sort of building off of what we were just talking about, he's someone that he looked fine in his 4 starts last season, and I think the Eagles unfairly placed a lot of pressure on him by anointing him as the starter, unchallenged, really, and he's worn down. There wasn't a large enough sample size there to definitively say, we got our answer right here, and now we just have to find out who's going to be playing opposite him. Because remember, in training camp, they alternated a lot of players around him, but Reed was the constant. And I don't think that he was really challenged. And I also think that he's just ill-equipped to be a starter in this league. I think he's a classic number 3, and when there's been times where he's looked fine, there's been times where his tackling is rather shoddy. You mentioned the Cardinals game. You mentioned him getting run over, trying to tackle Saquon, who pretty much carried him 3 yards in the end zone on Sunday. And he's a player that you could also look at Nakobe Dean. Those were 2 guys that the Eagles went into the offseason and through training camp pretty confident that those guys are going to be foundational pieces to their defense. And you can argue, not so much with Reed, but you can certainly look at it and say those 2 players have not lived up to the expectations that the Eagles put on them, fair or unfair.
Andrew, Brian Johnson got a head coaching opportunity today, and I know that you were excited about him at the beginning of the year. When you look back at his season, the head coaching thing, sometimes it's related. Obviously, he's a guy who was good history working with quarterbacks, so I could see the synergy there. But was he a guy that was disappointing? Do you think that he was about what you thought he would be when you look at this offense, Brian Johnson, this year?
Well, gosh, you and I could do 45 to an hour just talking about Brian Johnson and my impressions of the offense. But he's obviously a lightning rod, across the Delaware Valley and in the surrounding areas right now. It's a polarizing guy, but look, you're right. I did go into the season with high expectations of Brian Johnson, just like many did. And do I feel that he's been unfairly maligned? Partly, yeah. I do feel like it's easy to point the finger and say he's the main culprit for the Eagles' shortcomings on offense. He certainly has a hand in it. He has not been great at all, but there are you could point to different parts of the season where. And you look at the end of that Seattle game, which was revealed, a couple weeks ago from A.J. Brown, last week, really. And I just think it is a collective, collaborative effort in what's caused the offense to not reach expectations. And, yeah, Brian Johnson, you like to see more creativity. You like to see more innovative route concepts and things of that nature. But I also think that there's been many times that I could point to this season where the offense has lacked execution, has lacked discipline, untimely penalties, and things like that. So they're all across the board. They really have not lived up to their expectation there. I'm not surprised, Mike, that he's getting a head coaching opportunity. He was highly sought after even last season. Steve Wilkes, you may remember, with the Carolina Panthers, wanted to bring him on staff, but the Eagles, it was the worst kept secret in the league. The Eagles knew that he was going to be their offensive coordinator. And, it's not going to – people's impressions of him isn't going to be drastically altered after one season. And there's a lot of different factors that have contributed to the Eagles' shortcomings on offense. And yes, he has a hand in it, but he's far from the primary reason, in my opinion.
All right, Andrew, Monday night, they're going to play probably an inferior talent in terms of roster in Tampa Bay. Do you think that Nick Sirianni and these coordinators on both sides are coaching for their jobs? If they lose this game, the next time we talk, are we going to be talking about who the next coaching staff will be?
Well, you can, if they lose this game in dramatic fashion, you can make a case for the head coach being replaced, although it may be slight and not very likely. But I have a hard time envisioning Matt back, and Sean Desai most certainly won't be back, given how things have played out there. I think you're going to see a whole new defensive staff. There's going to be an overhaul there. Defensive staff is going to be kind of interesting because you look at the quarterback coach and Alex Tanner, young coach, but has Jalen Hurts improved or has he regressed mechanically? To me, there's been a lot of signs that reminded me of the 2021 version of Jalen Hurts. Maybe you look at the quarterback coach might not be back. We don't know what's going to happen with Brian Johnson. I think that if he doesn't get the head coaching job, a head coaching job, he'll probably be back. Because can you imagine if you're a prospective coach and you're looking to come to Philadelphia and you just got rid of your offensive coordinator and your defensive coordinator within a year after you just, you bang the table for these guys?
Yeah.
I mean, what does that say about the stability of this organization if you're willing to do that? But all that being said, I think you're going to see a complete overhaul of the defensive staff and probably some offensive coaches that won't be returning.
By the way, if you're just tuning in, Brian Johnson has a interview with the Carolina Panthers for their head coaching job. So keep that in mind as he gets ready. And Assistant General Manager Alec Hallaby is interviewing for the Commanders GM job today and the Carolina job on Friday. So some interviews happening for the Eagles as they get ready for a playoff game on Monday night. He's Andrew DiCecco. You can read more of him over at InsideTheBirds.com, and he does a great job right here on Football at 4 on the Sports Best. Thank you, buddy.
Anytime, Mike G. Talk soon.